The wind dragged itself across the Arizona plains that night, sweeping sand and dust like ghosts over the lonely ranch. The air carried that dry bitterness that comes before a storm, the kind that makes the horses restless and the coyotes quiet. Inside the weather-beaten cabin, Thomas Grayson sat by the flickering lantern, a bottle of cheap whiskey in one hand and a half-carved piece of wood in the other. The rhythmic scrape of his knife against the timber echoed through the empty room. He carved not for art but for silence. The old clock on the wall ticked like it was measuring out his solitude. Every sound was magnified. The creak of the chair, the hiss of wind through the cracks, the faint drip of rain starting on the roof. It was a night for regrets, and Thomas had plenty. He'd come to this land 10 years earlier chasing gold and peace. He found neither. What he did find was a hard stretch of soil, a cabin, and the quiet that men either learn to love or go mad from. He thought he'd learned to love it. But lately even the silence had teeth. Then came the knock, soft, hurried, frightened. For a moment he thought it was just the wind, but it came again, 3 short raps on the door. He set the knife down and stood slowly, shoulders stiff from long hours of work. "Who's there?" He called no answer. Just the hiss of rain thickening outside. He unlatched the door and the storm spilled in, a cold gust and 2 figures cloaked in darkness. They stumbled forward, half collapsed against the threshold. Thomas's hand shot to the rifle leaning by the door, but when the lightning cracked, it lit their faces. 2 young women, skin bronzed by sun, dark hair matted from rain. The elder one spoke first, her voice shaking from exhaustion. "Please, we mean no harm. We've been walking for miles. We just need shelter." Thomas hesitated. He'd heard enough stories to know how dangerous the frontier could be, for both sides. "Who are you?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "Apache," the older said. "Our village burned. Soldiers came." She swallowed hard. "We ran." The younger one said nothing, just clung to her sister's arm, trembling. Thomas studied them, torn between instinct and pity. Apache. The word carried all the weight of war, blood, and rumor. Yet in front of him were not warriors, just 2 frightened souls soaked to the bone, their bare feet red from the mud. He stepped aside slowly. "Come in before the wind kills you." They entered, cautious as deer. The cabin was simple. 1 table, a fireplace, a cot in the corner. Thomas closed the door behind them, feeling the temperature of the room shift, not from heat but from the unfamiliar presence of life. He poured water into a tin cup and handed it to the older one. She took it without thanks, but her eyes softened slightly as she helped her sister drink. "Name's Thomas Grayson," he said, trying to sound casual. "This is my land. Ain't seen anyone come this far out in months." The older woman met his gaze steadily. "I am Kaya. This is my sister Nita. Where were you heading?" "Nowhere," she said simply. "Only away." The rain beat harder on the roof. The fire popped. Thomas sat again, leaning back in his chair, studying them. They looked young. No older than 20 for the elder, maybe 16 for the younger. Their clothes were torn and muddy, but their dignity was still intact. Kaya's eyes were sharp, alive with something that looked like defiance. He felt that old ache stir in him, the one born from years of solitude. "Shelter's scarce out here," he muttered, half to himself. "Ain't got much room for guests." Kaya straightened. "We will sleep by the fire." "We need nothing more." Thomas gave a short, humorless laugh. "Ain't how things work on this side of the line, miss." Her gaze tightened. "And how do they work?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low. "A man gives shelter. Sometimes he expects something back." The words hung there, ugly in the warm air. Nita's eyes widened and she clutched Kaya's hand. But Kaya didn't flinch. She just stared at him, her jaw hard, her shoulders squared. "You'll regret those words," she said softly. Thomas looked away first. The whiskey burned his throat as he took another swallow. He told himself he didn't mean it, not really, that it was just talk from a lonely man. But loneliness twists the mind and regret comes too late. The 3 sat in silence for a long while. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains. Inside, the fire painted their faces in orange and shadow. Thomas felt the weight of their eyes on him, the mistrust, the fear, and something else he couldn't name. When he finally spoke again, his tone had softened. "You can dry your clothes by the fire. I ain't gonna throw you out in that storm." Kaya said nothing but nodded slightly. She helped Nita remove her wet shawl and hung it by the hearth. The flames flickered, warming the room. Slowly, color returned to their faces. Thomas watched in silence. There was grace in the way they moved. Quiet, measured, unbroken even by exhaustion. He felt small in their presence, though he didn't know why. Maybe because they still carried a kind of strength he'd long forgotten in himself. After a while, he rose and brought them bread and a little salted pork. "Ain't much," he said, "but it'll keep you alive." Nita took it with both hands and whispered, "Thank you." Kaya only nodded again, her expression unreadable. They ate quietly while Thomas leaned against the wall, the whiskey growing heavier in his hand. The storm outside had become a living thing, moaning through the cracks, shaking the shutters. He found himself talking just to fill the silence. "Used to be a time this land was full of laughter," he said. "Had a wife once. She couldn't stand the loneliness. Went back east." He gave a bitter chuckle. "Can't blame her," neither woman replied. Kaya's eyes flicked toward him once, measuring his words. Finally, she said, "Maybe the land isn't lonely. Maybe the people are." He looked at her, caught off guard by the quiet wisdom in her tone. For a moment, the air between them changed, less hostile, more human. The fire crackled, lighting up their faces again. The shadows played tricks on his mind, and he thought he saw something like sorrow beneath Kaya's calm. "Where will you go when the rain stops?" he asked. "Wherever the earth allows us," she said. "We have nothing left." Her voice carried the weight of ashes, and he didn't press further. Instead, he tossed another log on the fire and stared into it, the flames reflecting in his tired eyes. The hours dragged. Thunder faded into distant rumbles. The storm was dying, but the night still held its breath. Nita had fallen asleep, her head resting on her sister's shoulder. Kaya sat upright, her gaze distant, her lips moving in a soft whisper. Maybe a prayer, maybe a memory. Thomas studied her, guilt gnawing at him for the words he'd spoken earlier. He opened his mouth to apologize, but couldn't find the right way to start. The fire popped again, loud enough to make them both glance up. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that neither of them truly belonged to this cruel land. "Finally," he said quietly, "you don't have to be afraid here." Kaya's answer was quick. "I am not afraid." "Not anymore," he almost smiled. "You should be." She looked at him steadily. "Then why did you open your door?" He had no answer. He poured the last of the whiskey into his cup, listening to the soft breathing of the sleeping girl, the hum of rain easing off. The weight of his isolation pressed harder than ever, and yet the presence of these strangers had changed the air in the cabin completely. When he finally spoke again, it was barely a whisper. "Maybe I just wanted to remember what it felt like to have someone knock." Kaya turned back toward the fire, the faintest trace of compassion softening her eyes. "Then you remember," she said. Outside, the clouds began to break, revealing a thin sliver of moonlight. It slipped through the window, silvering the walls and the rough lines of Thomas's face. For the first time in years, he felt awake. Alive, even. He sat there long after both sisters had fallen asleep, their breathing steady, their forms wrapped in blankets by the fire. The warmth of the room crept into his bones, loosening something that had been clenched for too long. When dawn began to edge the sky, Thomas stirred from his chair. The land outside steamed gently in the morning light. He looked down at the two women sleeping peacefully and felt an ache he couldn't name. He thought of what he'd almost done, of what his loneliness had nearly turned him into. And for the first time, he felt shame heavy enough to bend him. Quietly, he took one of the thick wool blankets from his bed and laid it over them. Then he stepped outside into the pale morning, the wind cool on his face, and whispered into the vast emptiness, "Maybe there's still a man left in me after all." Behind him, the cabin door creaked slightly with the breeze, as if the house itself had exhaled. And somewhere out on the horizon, the sun climbed higher, burning away the night that had nearly swallowed them all. The storm raged deep into the night, rattling the roof like an angry spirit. The fire burned low now, throwing long shadows across the cabin walls. The air was thick with smoke, rain, and the faint scent of damp earth carried in from the plains. Thomas sat motionless in his chair, staring into the flames, his mind swirling like the wind outside. He could hear the soft breathing of the sisters by the hearth. They hadn't moved much since they'd come in, too exhausted, too wary. Every so often, the elder one, Kaya, would glance up at him from across the room. Her eyes were dark and sharp as flint, but behind them was something that unsettled him. A quiet strength that didn't belong to someone beaten or broken. He'd seen strong men break on this land. Soldiers, drifters, dreamers. They all came chasing something, and the desert stripped them bare until there was nothing left but bone and dust. But she was different. Even in silence, she carried the weight of a storm greater than the one outside. He tried to speak, but the words stuck. He'd already said enough foolish things that night. Every time he thought of that moment, the way he'd looked at them, the thing he'd implied, shame burned through him again. Maybe the whiskey had loosened his tongue, but that wasn't an excuse. Kaya finally broke the silence. "You said we could stay only if we were your wives tonight." Thomas froze. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but each word struck like a hammer. "I said a lot of things I shouldn't have," he muttered. "You meant them." He didn't answer. The fire popped, and a spark leapt from the logs. Nita stirred beside her sister, rubbing her eyes. She looked so young, barely more than a girl, and for the first time Thomas realized how monstrous his own words must have sounded. The guilt dug deeper. Kaya stood slowly, her movements fluid and deliberate. She crossed the room until she stood just a few feet from him. The glow of the fire lit her face, tired, streaked with dirt, but steady and proud. "Do you think we are toys, Mr. Grayson?" she asked softly. Thomas met her gaze. "No, I think I'm a fool who talks too much when he's drunk." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Then you are right about that." He half expected her to strike him. Instead, she knelt by the fire and stirred it with the iron poker, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "You are not the first man to say such things," she murmured. "But maybe you are the first who feels sorry after." Thomas watched her quietly. There was no anger in her tone, only a deep exhaustion that seemed older than she was. After a long moment, he spoke again. "You've got every reason to hate me, but I'm not your enemy." "Then who is?" she asked, not looking up. He thought of her words earlier. "Soldiers came. We ran." He'd heard stories. Raids on Apache villages, retribution for attacks, whole families caught between revenge and survival. It was a cruel land where everyone bled and no one was innocent. "Maybe everyone is," he said finally. She glanced at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "That's a sad way to live." "I reckon it is," he said, leaning back. "But it's the only way I've learned." For a while, neither spoke. The only sounds were the wind and the fire's steady crackle. Then quietly, Kaya said, "You asked something from us you had no right to ask. You should know our people do not forgive easily." Thomas nodded, his jaw tight. "I don't deserve forgiveness." She stood again, and he realized how tall she was, how her presence filled the small cabin. "Maybe not, but you will listen." She turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the door as if she were seeing something far away. "We were not alone when the soldiers came. My father was a leader, wise, kind. He told us to run when they rode down from the ridge. We ran through the fire, through the smoke. We heard the screams, the shots." Her voice faltered just once. "We never saw him again." Nita's eyes welled with tears. She clutched her sister's hand tightly as though holding on to the only piece of home she had left. Thomas swallowed hard. He wanted to speak, to offer some useless comfort, but there was nothing to say. "You see," Kaya continued softly, "we have seen worse than hunger, worse than storms. We have seen men become beasts. So when you said what you did," she turned back toward him, her gaze cutting through the shadows. "You sounded like them." Thomas lowered his eyes. "I know. Do you?" she asked, stepping closer. "Because they said the same words. Shelter for the night. That is what they told my mother before they dragged her away." The knife edge in her tone made him look up sharply. And that's when he saw it, gleaming faintly in the firelight. Nita's hand had slipped behind her blanket, and in it was a blade, small but sharp, pressed against her thigh. Thomas didn't move. He didn't even breathe. "You will listen now," Kaya said, her voice cold as iron. "You will not touch us. You will not speak lies. If you try, you will not live to see morning." Her words were steady, not shouted, and that made them all the more terrifying. Thomas lifted his hands slowly. "You don't need that," he said, keeping his tone calm. "You're safe here." "We decide when we are safe," Kaya replied. The rain beat harder outside, hammering against the roof like a drum. The wind whistled through the cracks, a wild sound that seemed to echo her fury. He met her eyes and nodded. All right, you've got my word. I won't harm you. Her stare lingered a moment longer, testing the weight of his words. Then she motioned to her sister, who slowly lowered the blade. The tension broke like a rope snapping. Thomas exhaled slowly, rubbing his face with both hands. You've got fire in you, he said quietly. Reminds me of someone I used to know. Kaya didn't reply, but her expression softened a fraction. She stepped back toward her sister and sat again by the fire. The night dragged on. The storm outside began to lose its fury, but inside the silence was heavy, charged. Thomas stayed where he was, not daring to move closer. He could feel their mistrust, and he knew he'd earned it. He thought of the old stories his mother used to tell him as a boy, about sins that couldn't be undone, only repented for. Maybe this was one of them. Maybe this was his chance to start paying what he owed to a world he'd hurt more than helped. Hours passed. Kaya's knife now lay beside her, the fire's glow reflecting off its edge. Her eyes were half closed, but Thomas knew she wasn't asleep. Neither of them were. At some point he spoke, his voice rough. You were right to stop me. Kaya didn't open her eyes. I know. I've been alone too long, he said. Loneliness makes a man think he's owed something. Truth is, it makes him forget what being human means. Her gaze flickered toward him then, calm but unreadable. And now you remember? I'm trying to. She studied him for a long moment, then looked back at the fire. Then maybe you are different. Thomas didn't answer. He didn't want her forgiveness. He didn't even think he deserved her words. But her saying them made the weight in his chest a little lighter. When dawn began to creep across the horizon, the storm finally broke apart. Rain still dripped from the eaves, soft and steady, like the earth itself was sighing. Thomas stood and walked quietly to the door. He pushed it open just enough to let the cool air in. The plain stretched endless and clean, the sky washed in the pale blush of morning. Behind him he heard Kaya's voice, low but clear. We will leave when the sun rises high. He nodded, not turning around. You don't have to rush. We have always had to rush, she replied. That is how we survive. He looked down at his hands, rough, scarred, trembling faintly. If you need food or a horse, I can... We will take nothing more than what is owed, she interrupted, firm but not unkind. You gave shelter. That is enough. He turned then, meeting her eyes across the small room. No, he said quietly. You gave me something better. You reminded me I ain't gone completely to dust yet. For a moment neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was fragile, almost peaceful. Kaya gave a small nod, then looked toward her sister, still dozing by the fading fire. You should sleep, Mr. Grayson, you look tired. He almost smiled. Maybe I am. He went back to his chair, sat down, and watched the sisters for a long while. The flames had burned low, but their warmth lingered. As sleep tugged at his eyes, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. A quiet sense of grace. Outside, the first bird of morning cried out over the wet land. The night was over. The storm had passed, and with it, the worst of what he had been. And though Thomas Grayson didn't know it yet, that single night, the knock on the door, the blade, the mercy he'd almost forgotten, would be the one thing to change everything that came after. The hours after dawn stretched in uneasy silence. The fire had burned down to soft embers, and the scent of smoke lingered in the small cabin like a ghost that refused to leave. Thomas Grayson sat slouched in his chair, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots as he shifted, lost in thought. The storm had passed, but inside the air was still heavy, as if the tension had soaked into the walls and wasn't ready to let go. Kaya moved quietly around the cabin. She was careful not to wake her sister, who slept near the hearth wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of horses and pine. Every movement she made was deliberate, silent as a shadow. Her grace unnerved him. After all that had happened the night before, she seemed unbroken, untouched by fear, while he still sat wrestling with the weight of his own shame. He glanced at her now and again, trying not to be obvious. Her hair was unbound, dark as wet earth, catching the light in ripples. There was something in the way she stood straight and steady that reminded him of a tree that refused to bend even in a storm. It was pride, but not arrogance. It was survival. When she noticed his gaze, she didn't look away. You should rest, she said softly. Her voice was calm, but it carried command. He rubbed a hand over his jaw. the stubble scratching against his calloused fingers. "I've rested enough. You two, you need breakfast." He pushed himself up and reached for the basket near the shelf. There wasn't much. A few potatoes, some dry biscuits, a strip of jerky. He set them on the table, embarrassed by the meager offering. "Ain't much of a feast." "It's more than we had," Kaya replied. She came closer, her steps light but sure. "We'll be grateful for whatever you can share." Thomas nodded, avoiding her eyes. He busied himself with the small pan, heating water, slicing potatoes with a dull knife. The sound of the blade against the board filled the silence between them. Every few moments he caught Nita stirring, murmuring in her sleep. She was dreaming, maybe of home, a home that no longer existed. When the food was ready, he placed the pan on the table and motioned for them to eat. Kaya woke her sister gently. "Nita, come. The man has cooked." Nita sat up slowly, blinking at the morning light that filtered through the cracks in the walls. Her face was pale beneath the soot and exhaustion. "It smells good," she whispered. Thomas managed a faint smile. "Don't lie, girl. It's terrible." The humor in his tone surprised even him. He hadn't smiled in a long time. Kaya looked at him, and for the first time a small shadow of a smile crossed her own face. It wasn't warmth exactly, but something close, like the first hint of sunlight after too many days of rain. They ate in silence. The food was plain, but the warmth in their hands, the shared quiet, made it feel heavier somehow. When they finished, Kaya rose and began to clean the table. Thomas moved to stop her. "You don't have to do that." She looked at him steadily. "And you don't have to feed us." Yet you did. He didn't argue. There was something about her tone, simple, honest, that left no room for protest. She washed the dishes with rainwater, her movements slow and methodical. Thomas watched her, still wondering at the contradiction she carried, gentleness edged with steel. Nita wandered to the window, peering out toward the open land. "It's so wide," she whispered. "I didn't know the world could be this big." Thomas followed her gaze. Beyond the fence, the plains stretched endlessly, green and gold beneath the washed sky. "Ain't much out there but dust and ghosts," he said quietly. "Still," Nita replied, "it's free." Her words hit him harder than she could have known. Freedom. He'd once thought this land would give him that. But the truth was, he'd only traded one kind of cage for another. His loneliness had been the bars, his guilt the lock. Kaya must have seen something change in his face because she spoke softly. "You came here alone?" He nodded. "Yeah, a long time ago. Thought I'd make a life out here. I tried my hand at ranching, gold panning, trapping. None of it stuck. Guess the land's got a way of keeping a man humble. Or lonely," she said. He smiled faintly. "That too." She dried the last of the dishes and set them neatly on the shelf. Then, with a kind of quiet curiosity, she asked, "You said you had a wife once?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't spoken her name in years. "Yeah," he said finally. "Her name was Clara. We came here together. Thought we'd build something. She didn't take to the desert the way I did. Said it felt like living on the edge of the world. I told her the edge was where life got interesting." He paused. She didn't agree. "What happened to her?" Kaya asked. "She left," he said simply. "Went back east." I stayed. The silence that followed wasn't cruel. It was understanding. Kaya nodded slightly, as though she knew what it meant to lose people not to death but to distance. "Sometimes leaving is the only way to survive," she murmured. "Maybe," Thomas said. "Or maybe staying's just another kind of running." For a while, no one spoke. The wind picked up again outside, stirring the scent of sage and wet dust through the cracks. Thomas poured water into a cup and handed it to Kaya. Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment, not long enough to be deliberate, but long enough for both to feel it. They each pulled away, pretending not to notice. "I've seen men change in a single night," Kaya said suddenly. "When they realize they've done wrong, some fight harder to forget it. Others try to make it right." Thomas looked at her. "Which do you think I am?" "I don't know yet," she said. "But I'll know before we leave." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. He didn't know whether to feel grateful or afraid. By midday, the clouds had scattered. Sunlight spilled across the plains, turning the grass into a sea of gold. Thomas went outside to fetch water from the well, needing space to think. The land was quiet again, too quiet. No birds, no riders on the horizon, only the whisper of wind across the hills. He looked back toward the cabin. Through the small window, he could see Kaya tending to her sister. The sight stirred something unfamiliar in him. Not desire this time, but an ache, a kind of wistful longing he couldn't name. They were strangers, yet in less than a day, they had unsettled everything inside him. When he returned, Nita was awake and sitting by the door, her dark eyes watching him with a shy curiosity. "Are you a bad man?" she asked suddenly. The question startled him. "What makes you ask that?" "You looked like one last night," she said simply. "But now you look sad." He let out a breath, half a laugh. "Maybe I'm both." Kaya's voice came from behind her sister. "He's trying not to be." Thomas turned toward her. There was no accusation in her tone this time, just quiet observation. He nodded once. "You see too much. It's how we've stayed alive," she replied. He gestured to the open door. "You could stay a few days if you wanted. The soldiers won't come this far west. You'd be safe," she hesitated. "Safe?" she echoed softly. "That's not a word our people believe in anymore." He had no answer for that. Instead, he said, "I've got work to do around the ranch. You can stay while I'm out. There's a stream a mile north if you need to wash up." "Why are you helping us now?" she asked. "Because you feel guilty?" "Because it's right," he said simply. Kaya studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we'll stay until the sun sets tomorrow. After that we move on." He accepted that without argument. Maybe he didn't deserve their trust, but for now, having them there gave the old cabin a heartbeat again. The rest of the day passed in uneasy peace. Thomas worked the fence line, mended a gate, fed the horses, small ordinary things that suddenly felt less empty than before. Each time he looked back at the cabin, he could see movement inside, the flicker of shadows. Life. When evening fell, the air turned cool again. The sisters helped start another fire. This time, the silence between them wasn't so sharp. Nita even laughed once, in a small, fragile sound, but real. Thomas found himself listening just to hear it again. Kaya caught him watching and said, "She hasn't laughed in weeks. You should be proud." "I didn't do nothing," he said. "You listened," Kaya said. "Sometimes that's enough." Later, when Nita had fallen asleep again, Kaya sat near the doorway looking out at the stars. Thomas sat across from her, the fire between them. The glow painted her face in bronze and gold, softening the edges of her weariness. "You said your father was a leader," Thomas began quietly. "What was he like?" She smiled faintly, the kind of smile born from both love and pain. "He believed the land had a soul. He said every stone, every river remembers the footsteps of those who came before. He taught us never to take more than we needed. The soldiers, they thought that made him weak. They were wrong." Thomas nodded slowly. "Sounds like a good man." "He was," Kaya said. "He told me something before we ran. He said, 'You'll meet people who've forgotten the language of mercy. Teach them if you can.'" Her eyes met his then, and he felt the words hit him like a hammer. "Guess I needed the lesson," he said quietly. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe you were waiting for someone to remind you." The fire crackled between them, filling the silence that followed. Outside, coyotes called to one another in the distance. The night felt alive again, not hostile this time, just vast and breathing. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You'll go tomorrow?" "Yes," she said. "We can't stay. The world doesn't let us stay anywhere for long." He wanted to ask them not to leave, but he knew better. They weren't meant to belong to any one place. They were wind, movement, survival itself, and he was a man tied to the land, learning too late how to be kind again. When the fire burned low, Kaya rose and draped a blanket over her sister. She turned toward him, her voice soft. "You've changed since last night." He gave a tired smile. "You'd be surprised how much can change in one night." She nodded, then looked toward the window where the moonlight streamed in like silver water. "Then maybe the desert isn't as empty as it looks." He followed her gaze. "No," he said quietly. "Maybe it's full of ghosts trying to make peace with the living." Their eyes met once more, and for a long heartbeat the world seemed to pause. The ranch, the wind, even the fire itself. Two broken paths had crossed in the middle of nowhere, and somehow, that had been enough to start mending something inside both of them. Outside, the night deepened, endless and forgiving. And in the flicker of the dying fire, the ranch that had once felt like a tomb now felt for the first time like a home.